When I found the champagne receipt in Brandon's coat pocket on December 15th, my world shifted. 2 bottles of Dom Pérignon at the Aspen Ritz Carlton charged to his personal card, the same husband who claimed he'd be spending Christmas week in dreary Chicago meetings with potential clients. The same husband who apologized profusely about missing our 3rd wedding anniversary celebration because work demanded his complete attention. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. As I stared at that crumpled receipt, one thought crystallized in my mind: if Brandon wanted to play games with the truth, he'd just challenge someone who made a living crafting perfect narratives and controlling public perception. My name is Claire Thompson, and until 3 weeks ago, I believed I was living the American dream. At 29, I'd built a reputation as one of Denver's most sought-after brand strategists, the woman behind viral campaigns that transformed struggling businesses into household names. My corner office at Meridian Marketing overlooked the Rocky Mountains, and my client roster read like a who's who of Colorado's business elite. I specialized in crisis management and reputation rehabilitation, helping companies navigate scandals and rebuild their public image. The irony of what I'd soon discover about my own life wasn't lost on me. Brandon and I met 4 years ago at a charity gala I'd organized for the Denver Children's Hospital. He was representing his pharmaceutical sales company, and I was managing the event's publicity and donor relations. Tall and broad-shouldered with sandy brown hair and an easy smile, Brandon had that particular confidence of someone who'd never struggled to make friends or close deals. He approached my registration table during the cocktail hour, complimenting the elegant setup and asking intelligent questions about the fundraising goals. "You've transformed this entire ballroom," he said, gesturing toward the sophisticated winter wonderland theme I'd designed. "My company's been looking for someone who understands how to create experiences that actually move people to action. Would you be interested in discussing a potential partnership?" That first conversation lasted 2 hours. Brandon was different from the men I typically dated, less obsessed with appearances and more genuinely interested in my work's impact. He asked thoughtful questions about the psychology behind effective messaging and seemed genuinely impressed by my strategic thinking. When he asked me to dinner the following week, it felt natural and unforced. Our relationship developed steadily over 18 months. Brandon was attentive without being overwhelming, successful without being arrogant, and he introduced me to outdoor activities I'd never tried: skiing, hiking, rock climbing. He balanced my work-focused intensity with a playful energy that made me laugh. His parents, Patricia and Richard Thompson, welcomed me warmly into their Cherry Hills Village social circle, though I sensed Patricia's approval was somewhat conditional on my professional success rather than genuine affection. The Thompson family represented old Denver money. Richard's grandfather had made a fortune in mining, and subsequent generations had diversified into real estate and investments. They weren't flashy wealthy, but rather possessed that understated affluence of people who'd never questioned their place in the world's hierarchy. Family dinners at their estate involved discussions of ski trips to Vail, charity board positions, and the social calendar of Denver's established families. I contributed when I could, but often felt like I was translating between different languages of privilege. Brandon proposed during a weekend trip to Steamboat Springs, presenting a stunning vintage engagement ring that had belonged to his grandmother. The proposal itself was perfectly orchestrated: a private dinner at a mountaintop restaurant, twinkling lights reflecting off fresh snow, and a heartfelt speech about building a life together. I said yes without hesitation, genuinely believing I'd found my partner and best friend. Our wedding was a masterpiece of coordinated elegance, if I do say so myself. I planned every detail personally, unable to trust such an important event to anyone else's vision. The ceremony took place at the Broadmoor in Colorado Springs, with 300 guests witnessing our vows in a ceremony that made the society pages of Denver Life magazine. Patricia had opinions about everything from the flower arrangements to the band selection, but Brandon and I navigated her input with humor and compromise. The day felt magical, surrounded by friends and family who seemed genuinely happy for our union. Marriage initially exceeded my expectations. Brandon was a considerate partner who respected my demanding work schedule and celebrated my professional victories. We settled into a comfortable rhythm in our downtown loft apartment, hosting dinner parties for our friends and taking weekend trips to explore Colorado's endless recreational opportunities. I expanded my business, bringing on 2 additional strategists and landing several high-profile accounts that solidified Meridian Marketing's reputation as Denver's premier boutique agency. The first subtle changes began about 6 months ago. Brandon started working longer hours, claiming his territory had expanded to include several mountain resort communities. He'd leave early Monday mornings and return late Friday evenings, explaining that establishing relationships with Aspen and Vail clientele required face-to-face attention. I supported his ambition, understanding how demanding client development could be in competitive markets. Then came the phone calls that ended abruptly when I entered the room, the increased attention to his appearance before these trips, and the vague responses when I asked specific questions about his new clients. Brandon had always been social and outgoing, but something felt different about his energy, more secretive, more deliberately casual in his explanations. The Christmas season amplified these changes. Brandon announced in early December that he'd secured a massive potential contract with a Chicago-based company, but closing the deal would require spending Christmas week in meetings. He seemed genuinely disappointed, apologizing repeatedly, and promising to make it up to me with a New Year's trip somewhere warm and romantic. "I hate missing Christmas with you," he said, pulling me close on the couch while we decorated our tree. "But this contract could set us up for the next 5 years. The timing is terrible, but sometimes you have to sacrifice for the bigger picture." I believed him because I wanted to, and because his explanation aligned with my own understanding of professional demands. I'd missed holidays and anniversaries for work emergencies, so Brandon's dedication seemed admirable rather than suspicious. I planned to spend Christmas with my parents in Fort Collins and use the quiet time to catch up on reading and plan strategies for my business's expansion in the new year. The discovery happened purely by accident. Brandon had returned from what he claimed was a scouting trip to Chicago, and I was hanging up his coat when the receipt fluttered to the floor. Dom Pérignon at the Aspen Ritz Carlton, dated 3 days earlier. My hands trembled as I studied the elegant hotel letterhead, trying to construct an innocent explanation for why my husband would be buying champagne at a luxury ski resort while supposedly evaluating conference facilities in the Midwest. I sat on our bed, staring at that receipt for nearly an hour. My marketing training had taught me to analyze information objectively, to look for patterns and inconsistencies in messaging. Brandon's story about Chicago meetings suddenly seemed full of holes. Why would someone scouting business venues purchase expensive champagne? Why hadn't he mentioned stopping in Aspen? Why did the receipt show a room service charge to a suite rather than meeting facilities? Instead of confronting Brandon immediately, my professional instincts kicked in. I needed more information before making accusations. If my suspicions were correct, I wanted complete understanding of the situation before deciding my response. If I was wrong, I'd apologize for doubting him and work on rebuilding trust. But something deep in my gut told me that receipt represented the tip of a much larger deception. I started paying closer attention to Brandon's behavior over the following days. He'd always been naturally affectionate, but now his kisses felt performative, his compliments hollow. When he talked about the upcoming Chicago trip, his eyes didn't quite meet mine, and his explanations contained unnecessary details that felt rehearsed rather than spontaneous. He mentioned specific restaurants and hotels he'd researched, painting an elaborate picture of a working holiday he clearly had no intention of taking. The breakthrough came when I decided to use my professional resources. One advantage of working in marketing and public relations was having contacts throughout Denver's business community, including several private investigators who'd helped me manage corporate crisis situations. I called Marcus Webb, a former Denver police detective who now specialized in corporate and personal investigations. "Marcus, I need a favor," I said during our phone conversation. "It's personal and I need absolute discretion." "Of course, Claire, what's going on?" "I think my husband might be lying about a business trip, and I need to know the truth before I confront him. Can you do some basic research without him knowing?" Marcus agreed to help, understanding that sometimes knowing the truth was the only way to move forward with dignity. He asked for Brandon's basic information and promised to have preliminary findings within 48 hours. While waiting for Marcus's report, I conducted my own digital investigation. Brandon had become more protective of his phone recently, but we shared several online accounts and cloud storage systems. I discovered that his location services showed frequent trips to Aspen over the past 3 months, trips that coincided with his supposed Chicago client development efforts. I found hotel confirmations in his email, deleted but recoverable from the trash folder. The Aspen Ritz Carlton, the Little Nell, the St. Regis. A pattern of luxury weekend stays that painted a picture of regular romantic getaways. Most damning was a reservation confirmation for December 20th. Beprenny 7, a week-long stay in a presidential suite that cost more than most people's monthly salary. My hands shook as I scrolled through restaurant reservations, spa appointments, and activity bookings. Every detail suggested a romantic vacation planned with someone other than me. The champagne receipt wasn't an anomaly. It was evidence of an ongoing affair that had been carefully hidden behind the facade of business development. I printed everything, creating a file of evidence that would have made any private investigator proud. Credit card statements showing charges at romantic restaurants, florist receipts for arrangements I'd never received, jewelry store purchases for items I'd never seen. Brandon had been living a double life for months, and I'd been the oblivious wife funding his deception through our joint accounts. Marcus called the next evening with information that confirmed my worst fears. Claire, I'm sorry to tell you this, but your husband has been seen repeatedly in Aspen with a woman named Vanessa Brooks. They've been staying at high-end resorts and behaving like a couple. My source at the Ritz-Carlton confirmed they have a reservation for Christmas week under both their names. Vanessa Brooks. The name hit me like a physical blow because I recognized it immediately.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Brandon's college girlfriend, the woman his mother had mentioned admiringly during our early dating conversations. Oh, Vanessa was such a lovely girl, Patricia had said. We always thought she and Brandon would end up together, but sometimes timing just doesn't work out. I'd met Vanessa briefly at a Denver charity event 2 years ago. She was beautiful in that effortless way of women who'd grown up with money and confidence. Blonde hair, perfect teeth, and the kind of casual elegance that looked expensive even in simple clothing. Brandon had introduced us politely, mentioning their college connection, but I hadn't sensed any romantic tension. Apparently, I'd been naive about the depth of their ongoing relationship. The pieces fell into place with devastating clarity. Vanessa had moved back to Colorado from California 6 months ago, exactly when Brandon's behavior had started changing. She'd taken a position with a high-end real estate company specializing in luxury mountain properties, which explained Brandon's sudden interest in developing clients in Aspen and Vail. Their relationship had rekindled under the guise of his professional expansion, and I'd been supporting their affair financially and emotionally, while believing my husband was building our future. I spent that night walking around our apartment, looking at our life with new eyes. The photos on our mantel, the furniture we'd chosen together, the Christmas decorations we'd hung just weeks earlier, everything felt contaminated by the knowledge of Brandon's betrayal. I'd been living in a carefully constructed illusion, while he'd been building a separate reality with another woman. Instead of falling apart, I felt a strange calm settle over me. My professional training in crisis management had taught me that emotional reactions rarely produced optimal outcomes. The most effective responses required strategic thinking, careful planning, and precise execution. If Brandon wanted to spend Christmas week with Vanessa, celebrating what was essentially their honeymoon while lying to me about business obligations, he was about to discover that deceiving someone who specialized in managing information and controlling narratives was an enormous mistake. I spent the next 3 days planning my response with the same methodical approach I brought to my most challenging client campaigns. Brandon's deception wasn't just a personal betrayal, it was a strategic error that had provided me with extensive documentation and the element of surprise. He believed I was naive and trusting, unaware that my professional success depended on reading people accurately and anticipating their motivations. The beauty of my situation was that Brandon had unknowingly given me every tool I needed for the perfect response. He documented his affair through digital receipts, social media check-ins, and shared calendar appointments. He'd involved mutual friends and family members in his deception, creating a web of complicity that could be exposed systematically. Most importantly, he'd underestimated my capacity for strategic thinking under pressure. I opened a bottle of wine and sat at my kitchen table, surrounded by printed evidence of my husband's double life. Tomorrow Brandon would leave for what he believed was a secret romantic vacation with his college sweetheart. He had no idea that his carefully planned Christmas surprise was about to become the foundation for consequences he'd never imagined possible. The marketing strategist in me recognized this as the perfect setup for a campaign that would achieve multiple objectives: exposing the truth, protecting my interests, and ensuring that everyone involved understood the cost of deception. Brandon wanted to play games with the truth during the season of giving. I was about to teach him that some gifts come with prices he'd never want to pay. Brandon kissed me goodbye on December 20th, with what I now recognized as practiced deception. He stood in our kitchen, travel bag slung over his shoulder, apologizing once again for the terrible timing of his Chicago meetings. His performance was flawless, the reluctant husband sacrificing personal happiness for professional necessity. He even managed to look genuinely disappointed as he promised to call every evening and return home by December 28th, with good news about the contract. "I'll miss you every second," he said, cupping my face with both hands. "Next Christmas will be different, I promise. We'll go somewhere amazing to celebrate." I smiled and kissed him back, marveling at how easily deception rolled off his tongue. "Just focus on closing the deal. I'll be fine spending Christmas with my parents." After Brandon left, I waited exactly 30 minutes before implementing the plan I'd spent 3 sleepless nights perfecting. My first call went to Nicole, my best friend and fellow marketing strategist, who agreed to meet me for coffee within the hour. Nicole had been suspicious of Brandon's recent behavior, noting changes in his demeanor during our double dates that I'd attributed to work stress. "I need your help with something that's going to sound insane," I said as we settled into a corner booth at our favorite downtown cafe. I slid a folder across the table containing copies of the most damning evidence. "Brandon isn't in Chicago, he's in Aspen with his college girlfriend, and I'm going to make sure everyone knows exactly what kind of man they've been celebrating." Nicole's eyes widened as she flipped through the hotel receipts, restaurant reservations, and romantic spa bookings. "Claire, this is devastating. I'm so sorry. What do you need from me?" "I need you to help me document everything that's about to happen. This isn't just about catching him in a lie, it's about exposing a pattern of calculated deception that's been months in the making. I want everyone who enabled this to understand their role in what's coming next." I'd spent considerable time analyzing the social dynamics that had allowed Brandon's affair to flourish. His mother Patricia knew about Vanessa's return to Denver, and had made several comments about how lovely it was that old friends were reconnecting. His sister Karen had mentioned seeing Brandon in Aspen during her own ski weekend, casually asking if I'd enjoyed the trip when I'd been in Denver the entire time. His best friend Marcus had covered for him during poker nights that were supposedly work events. The Thompson family's complicity ran deeper than simple ignorance. They'd actively participated in maintaining Brandon's false narrative, either through willful blindness or deliberate collaboration. Patricia had always preferred Vanessa to me, making subtle comments about breeding and background that suggested I was a temporary detour from Brandon's predetermined path. The Christmas deception represented the culmination of years of treating me as an outsider who could be discarded when convenient. My strategy would unfold in 3 phases, each designed to maximize impact while maintaining my dignity and legal position. Phase 1 involved gathering real-time evidence of Brandon's deception. Phase 2 would expose the truth to the right people at the right moments. Phase 3 would ensure long-term consequences that matched the scale of the betrayal. I drove to Cherry Hills Village that afternoon for what I'd told Patricia would be a quick visit to drop off Christmas gifts before heading to my parents' house. The Thompson estate looked magnificent in the winter sunlight, decorated with elegant white lights and pristine wreaths that reflected Patricia's impeccable taste. I rang the doorbell carrying wrapped presents, and wearing the smile I'd perfected during 3 years of family gatherings. "Claire, darling," Patricia said, greeting me with air kisses that had always felt performative rather than affectionate. "I'm so sorry Brandon couldn't be here for Christmas. These business demands can be so inconvenient." "Actually, that's what I wanted to talk to you about," I said, settling into the living room where Richard was reading the newspaper by the fireplace. "I've been thinking about surprising Brandon in Chicago, maybe flying out to spend a day or 2 with him before he comes home." Patricia's reaction was immediate and telling. Her face went pale for just a moment before she recovered her composure. "Oh, I don't think that's a good idea, dear. You know how Brandon gets when he's focused on important negotiations. He specifically mentioned wanting to avoid distractions until the deal is finalized." "Did he?" I asked innocently. "When did he tell you that?" "He didn't mention discussing the trip with you." Richard lowered his newspaper, sensing the shift in conversation tone. Patricia fumbled slightly, clearly realizing she'd revealed knowledge she shouldn't possess. "Oh, you know, he might have mentioned it in passing during our last phone call. I just think surprising him might not be the best approach right now." I nodded thoughtfully, letting the moment stretch before changing subjects to holiday plans and family traditions. But the seed was planted. Patricia knew more about Brandon's trip than she'd admitted, and her discomfort confirmed my suspicions about family complicity. I stayed for exactly 45 minutes, long enough to seem normal, but not so long as to invite deeper conversation. My next stop was Brandon's office, where I had legitimate business dropping off gifts for his colleagues and wishing everyone happy holidays. His assistant Jennifer had always been friendly toward me, and she greeted me warmly when I arrived with a gift basket and homemade cookies. "These are beautiful, Claire. Brandon is so lucky to have someone who thinks of everyone during the holidays. I just hope his Chicago meetings go well," I said casually. "It must be difficult being away from family during Christmas week." Jennifer's confusion was evident. "Chicago meetings? I thought he was taking vacation days this week. His calendar shows him as out of office through the 28th, but I didn't realize he was working." "Perfect." I commiserated about the demands of client development and left the office with one more piece of evidence that Brandon's deception extended beyond our marriage into his professional life. His colleagues believed he was on vacation while his family thought he was working. The pattern of lies was becoming increasingly elaborate and unsustainable. That evening, I put phase 2 into motion. I'd created a private Instagram account using my maiden name and carefully crafted privacy settings that would allow me to observe without being detected. Through strategic searching, I located Vanessa's social media profiles and discovered that she had a tendency to share her experiences through carefully curated posts that stopped just short of identifying her companions. Her Instagram story from that afternoon showed a first-class airplane seat with the caption "Christmas Adventures Begin." The next image featured champagne flutes against a mountain backdrop, followed by a photo of an elegant hotel room, with the comment, "Sometimes the best gifts come wrapped in unexpected moments." She was documenting their romantic getaway in real time, apparently confident that her privacy settings would protect her from unwanted observers. I screenshot everything, building a digital trail that correlated perfectly with Brandon's supposed business itinerary. While he'd texted me about delayed flights and demanding clients, Vanessa was posting photos of couples' massage appointments and dinner reservations at restaurants that specialized in romantic ambiance rather than business networking. My phone rang at 8 o'clock, Brandon's nightly check-in call right on schedule. His voice carried that false warmth of someone performing concern while distracted by more interesting activities. "Hi, sweetheart, just wanted to hear your voice before these evening meetings start up again. How was your day?" "Quiet and productive," I replied, keeping my tone light and natural. "I visited your parents to drop off gifts. Your mother seemed to think you'd mentioned wanting to avoid distractions during negotiations. I don't remember you telling me that." A brief pause, barely perceptible unless you were listening for it. "Oh, you know, Mom, she worries about me overcommitting. I might have mentioned something about needing to focus, but I didn't mean I don't want to talk to you." "Of course not. How are the meetings going? Are you optimistic about closing the deal?" "Very optimistic. Actually, I think we might wrap up earlier than expected. The client is more interested than I initially thought." I smiled into the phone, knowing that Vanessa's social media posts would soon contradict every word he was saying. "That's wonderful news. I can't wait to hear all about it when you get home." After we hung up, I spent an hour documenting our conversation alongside the evidence I'd collected throughout the day. Brandon's lies were becoming more complex and contradictory, requiring him to maintain multiple false narratives with different audiences. His confidence in his deception was about to become his greatest vulnerability. The next morning brought Christmas Eve and a post on Vanessa's Instagram story that made my heart race with anticipation. She'd shared a photo of an engagement ring, a stunning emerald-cut diamond that looked remarkably similar to expensive jewelry Brandon had supposedly purchased for client gifts according to his credit card statements. Her caption read, "When dreams become reality in the most perfect setting." I immediately called Marcus, the private investigator, who confirmed what the photo suggested. "They're engaged, Claire." My contact at the resort saw the proposal happen on the hotel's private terrace yesterday evening. It was planned as a Christmas Eve surprise. The audacity was breathtaking. Brandon had proposed to another woman using money from our joint accounts while lying to me about business meetings. He'd orchestrated this elaborate Christmas deception not just to spend time with his mistress, but to begin a new life with her. The hotel reservations, the romantic dinners, the expensive champagne, everything had been building toward this moment. I felt something crystallize inside me that went beyond anger or hurt. This wasn't just infidelity, it was a calculated demolition of everything I'd believed about my life and future. Brandon had been planning his exit from our marriage while maintaining the facade of a loving husband. The Christmas timing wasn't coincidental, it was designed to create maximum emotional impact while positioning him as the victim of impossible professional demands. My response needed to match the scale and sophistication of his deception. I spent Christmas Eve afternoon crafting a series of communications that would expose the truth in ways Brandon couldn't deny, minimize, or spin to his advantage. This wasn't about revenge in the petty sense. It was about ensuring that everyone who'd participated in or enabled his lies understood the consequences of their choices. I started with a group text message to Brandon's family, sent at exactly 6 o'clock on Christmas Eve. The timing was intentional, late enough that any family gathering would be in full swing, but early enough that my message would dominate the evening's conversation. I hope everyone is having a wonderful Christmas Eve. I wanted to share some exciting news about Brandon's business trip to Chicago. It turns out he's actually in Aspen, where he proposed to Vanessa Brooks yesterday evening. I'm sure you'll want to congratulate them on their engagement. I'll be filing for divorce after the holidays, so please direct all future family communications through my attorney. I attached 3 photos: the hotel receipt I'd found, a screenshot of Vanessa's engagement announcement, and a credit card statement showing the jewelry purchase. Then I sent the message and turned off my phone. The silence that followed was almost audible. I could imagine the chaos erupting in the Thompson family's perfectly coordinated Christmas celebration as they processed the implications of what I'd shared. Patricia would be devastated that her careful social maneuvering had been exposed so publicly. Richard would be calculating financial and social consequences. Brandon's siblings would be scrambling to distance themselves from the scandal while protecting their own reputations. But the most beautiful part of my strategy was its simplicity. I hadn't made accusations or demands. I'd simply shared factual information in a tone that suggested I was passing along exciting family news. Anyone who tried to challenge my message would have to explain why they weren't surprised by Brandon's deception or why they'd helped maintain his false narrative. I spent Christmas Day with my parents in Fort Collins, telling them the truth about what I'd discovered and the steps I was taking to protect myself legally and financially. My father's reaction was quietly supportive, while my mother oscillated between outrage at Brandon's behavior and concern about my future. Their unconditional love and practical support reminded me that some relationships were built on genuine foundation rather than social convenience. "I'm proud of how you're handling this," my father said during our evening walk around their neighborhood. "You could have exploded or fallen apart, but you're thinking strategically about your interests and dignity." "I learned from the best," I replied, squeezing his arm. "You always taught me that emotional reactions rarely solve complex problems." My phone remained off throughout Christmas Day, but I could imagine the digital chaos my message had created. Brandon would return from his romantic proposal to discover that his carefully constructed double life had been exposed to everyone who mattered. His family would be dealing with social embarrassment and questions they couldn't answer without admitting their complicity. Vanessa would be learning that her romantic Christmas surprise came with consequences neither of them had anticipated. On December 26th, I finally turned my phone back on to find 47 missed calls, dozens of text messages, and several voicemails that ranged from angry to desperate. Brandon had called 16 times, his messages evolving from confusion to panic as he realized the scope of what had been revealed. His first voicemail was incredulous. "Claire, what is this crazy message you sent my family? Call me back immediately. This is completely inappropriate and based on some misunderstanding." By the 5th call, desperation had crept into his voice. "Please, Claire, just talk to me. Yes, I'm in Aspen, but it's not what you think. I can explain everything if you'll just give me a chance." The final message was recorded at 2 in the morning, his voice slurred with alcohol and exhaustion. "You've destroyed everything. Do you have any idea what you've done? My entire family is furious, Vanessa is crying, and you've made this situation so much worse than it needed to be. Call me back so we can fix this before it gets completely out of control." Patricia had left several messages as well, her tone shifting from imperious to pleading as she attempted to manage the social fallout of the situation. Her final voicemail was particularly revealing. "Claire, this is Patricia. I understand you're upset, and you have every right to be. But surely we can handle this situation with more discretion. The family's reputation is at stake, and involving lawyers seems unnecessarily dramatic. Please call me so we can discuss this properly. I listened to every message twice, marveling at how quickly the power dynamic had shifted. 24 hours earlier, Brandon and his family had believed they controlled the narrative and timeline of events. Now they were scrambling to respond to information they couldn't deny, while trying to minimize consequences they couldn't avoid. The beauty of my approach was its completeness. I hadn't left them room for alternative explanations or face-saving measures. The evidence was documented, the timeline was clear, and their complicity was obvious to anyone who examined their responses. Brandon's elaborate Christmas deception had become the foundation for his comprehensive exposure. I called my attorney that morning to schedule a meeting for the following day. Daniel Martinez had handled my business contracts for 3 years, and his family law partner specialized in high-asset divorce cases involving complex financial arrangements. I needed legal representation that matched my husband's resources and social connections. Based on what you've told me, Claire, you're in a strong position, Daniel said during our phone conversation. Colorado is a no-fault divorce state, but the evidence of financial deception and hidden assets could impact property divisions significantly. We'll want to freeze joint accounts immediately and conduct forensic accounting of all expenditures related to his affair. I want him to understand that deception has consequences, I said. Not just personally, but professionally and socially. He's been using our shared resources to fund a relationship that was designed to end our marriage. We'll make sure the financial impact reflects that reality. And Claire, you handled the initial disclosure perfectly. Many people make emotional decisions that hurt their legal position. You've protected yourself while creating a clear record of events. That afternoon, I finally returned Brandon's calls. He answered before the first ring finished, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. Claire, thank God. Where have you been? We need to talk immediately. Actually, Brandon, we don't. My attorney will be handling all future communications. I just wanted to let you know that I've moved out of the apartment and changed the locks. Your belongings will be packed and delivered to your parents' house. You can't do this. You can't just destroy our marriage, without giving me a chance to explain. I didn't destroy our marriage, Brandon. You did that when you started planning a future with another woman, while lying to me about business trips. The Christmas proposal was a nice touch, by the way. Using our joint credit card to buy her engagement ring showed remarkable attention to detail. The silence on the other end of the line lasted almost 30 seconds. When Brandon finally spoke, his voice had changed, less pleading, more calculating. You're going to regret handling this so publicly, Claire. My family has connections you can't imagine, and making enemies of the Thompsons wasn't your smartest move. Actually, Brandon, I think you'll find that publicly exposing deception tends to work in favor of the person telling the truth. But we'll let the lawyers sort out the details. I ended the call and blocked his number, feeling a profound sense of closure settling over me. The conversation had confirmed everything I'd suspected about his character and his family's approach to protecting their interests. Brandon's immediate pivot to threats rather than apologies revealed the entitled mindset that had made his deception possible in the first place. The social consequences of my revelation unfolded over the following days like a carefully orchestrated campaign. Denver's social circles were small enough that news traveled quickly, but sophisticated enough that reactions were measured and strategic. Former friends and business associates began choosing sides based on their own relationships and interests, creating a complex web of allegiances that worked largely in my favor. My business actually benefited from the situation. Several potential clients reached out, impressed by my strategic handling of a personal crisis. The same skills that had made me successful in brand management, analytical thinking, emotional control, strategic communication, had served me well in navigating the collapse of my marriage. I'd turned a devastating personal betrayal into a demonstration of professional competence. Nicole helped me move into a stunning loft apartment in the Reno district, a space that reflected my independence rather than compromise. The industrial aesthetic and downtown location felt like a fresh start, uncontaminated by memories of shared decisions and false promises. I hung my own artwork, arranged furniture according to my preferences alone, and created a home environment that celebrated solitude rather than partnership. The divorce proceedings began in early January with Brandon's predictable attempts to paint me as vindictive and unstable. His attorney argued that my public disclosure of his affair demonstrated emotional instability and poor judgment. But Daniel had prepared for these tactics, countering with evidence that my response was measured and strategic rather than impulsive and emotional. Mrs. Thompson discovered extensive evidence of financial deception and marital misconduct. Daniel explained to the mediator during our first session. Her communication to relevant family members was factual and appropriate given the circumstances. She has a right to protect herself from continued deception and financial exploitation. Brandon sat across from me during these sessions, looking diminished and defensive, his confidence replaced by the desperate energy of someone trying to salvage what remained of his reputation and resources. The easy charm that had initially attracted me was gone, replaced by calculating resentment that made me grateful for my earlier instincts about his character. Vanessa, I learned through mutual acquaintances, had ended their engagement within days of my revelation. The romantic Christmas proposal had lost its appeal when she realized the financial and social costs of their relationship. Brandon's deception hadn't just cost him his marriage, it had destroyed the very relationship he'd been planning to replace it with. The final phase of my strategy involved rebuilding my life according to my own values and priorities rather than external expectations. I expanded Meridian marketing, taking on challenging projects that utilized my crisis management expertise. My experience navigating a public personal scandal had given me credibility with clients facing similar challenges, and my business thrived in ways I hadn't anticipated. 6 months after that Christmas Eve revelation, I received an unexpected phone call from Patricia Thompson. Her voice carried none of its former imperious confidence, replaced by something that sounded remarkably like humility. "Claire, I hope you'll accept my apology for how our family handled your marriage to Brandon. I realize now that we enabled behavior that was inexcusable, and you deserved better from all of us." I listened to her carefully prepared words, recognizing the strategic nature of her outreach but also sensing genuine remorse beneath the calculated approach. Patricia was dealing with social consequences of her own, as Denver's established families had drawn their own conclusions about the Thompson family's complicity in Brandon's deception. "I appreciate you calling, Patricia," I replied. "I hope Brandon gets the help he needs to understand why deception ultimately destroys more than it protects." After we hung up, I sat in my beautiful new apartment, surrounded by the life I'd built from the ashes of my marriage, and felt something I hadn't experienced in months: genuine happiness. Brandon's Christmas deception had been intended to destroy me quietly and efficiently. Instead, it had freed me to discover my own strength and build a future based on truth rather than comfortable lies. The champagne receipt that started everything was framed on my office wall now, a reminder that sometimes the most devastating discoveries lead to the most liberating outcomes. Brandon had given me an unexpected gift that Christmas, the opportunity to reclaim my own story and write it according to my own values. It was, without question, the most perfect revenge imaginable, living well while he dealt with the consequences of choices he'd made in secret, believing he was clever enough to deceive someone whose professional success depended on seeing through exactly the kind of facade he'd constructed. The forensic accountant Daniel recommended turned out to be a meticulous woman named Sarah Chen, who specialized in uncovering hidden assets in high-conflict divorce cases. She arrived at my attorney's office on January 3rd, carrying 3 banker's boxes and wearing the kind of focused expression that suggested she genuinely enjoyed unraveling financial mysteries. "Your husband was sloppy," she said without preamble, spreading documents across the conference table. "People who think they're clever often leave the most obvious trails. Brandon Thompson created a pattern of financial deception that extends far beyond funding his affair." Over the next 2 hours, Sarah walked me through discoveries that made Brandon's Christmas betrayal seem like merely the culmination of a much larger scheme. He'd been systematically moving money from our joint accounts into investments and properties that were titled solely in his name. The pharmaceutical sales company had provided him with business credit cards that he'd used for personal expenses, creating a complex web of reimbursements and false expense reports that bordered on embezzlement. "Look at this," Sarah said, pointing to a spreadsheet that tracked transfers over the past 18 months. "Every month he moved exactly $3,000 from your joint savings into an investment account at a different institution. The transfers were small enough to avoid triggering automatic notifications, but consistent enough to total over $50,000. The money had funded not just his affair with Vanessa, but a lifestyle that included a secret apartment lease in downtown Denver, expensive clothing purchases, and what appeared to be gambling debts at several Colorado casinos. Brandon had been living as a single man while maintaining the facade of married stability, using our shared resources to subsidize deception that went far beyond romantic infidelity. The Christmas trip was just the most obvious example, Sarah continued. He's been taking these luxury vacations for months, always claiming business purposes, always charging expenses to accounts you couldn't monitor. The Aspen engagement was funded by money he'd stolen from your joint investment portfolio. I sat back in my chair, processing the scope of financial betrayal that went far beyond what I'd discovered through hotel receipts and credit card statements. Brandon hadn't just been unfaithful, he'd been systematically defrauding our marriage while planning his exit strategy. The romantic narrative of reconnecting with a college sweetheart was actually a calculated theft that had been months in the making. What are our options for recovery? Daniel asked, taking notes as Sarah continued presenting evidence. Colorado law allows for reimbursement when one spouse uses marital assets for personal benefit that doesn't serve the marriage, Sarah replied. Given the documentation we have, Claire could potentially recover the full amount plus damages. Brandon's pattern of financial deception strengthens her position considerably. The legal strategy began taking shape around Sarah's findings. Rather than pursuing a simple no-fault divorce, we would present evidence of financial misconduct that warranted restitution and potentially criminal charges. Brandon's corporate expense account fraud alone could result in federal charges if his employer decided to prosecute. I left that meeting feeling vindicated but also strangely sad. The man I'd married had been systematically robbing our future together while planning a different life with someone else. The Christmas proposal to Vanessa had been funded by money stolen from our shared savings account, making his betrayal both personal and criminal. That evening, I called my parents to update them on the legal proceedings and the extent of what we'd discovered. My father's reaction was characteristically measured but firm. Claire, this changes everything about how you should approach the divorce. Brandon isn't just a cheating husband, he's a financial criminal who used your marriage as cover for theft. You need to protect yourself completely. My mother's response was more emotional but equally supportive. I never trusted him completely, but I never imagined he was capable of this level of deception. Thank God you discovered everything when you did. Their unconditional support reminded me that some relationships were built on genuine trust and mutual respect rather than convenience and social positioning. The Thompson family's reaction to my revelations had shown me exactly how little I'd actually meant to them beyond my usefulness in maintaining their social facade. Brandon's desperate attempts to contact me continued throughout January, each message revealing new layers of entitlement and self-deception. He seemed genuinely unable to understand why I wouldn't agree to private mediation that would allow him to avoid the public consequences of his choices. His voicemails evolved from threats to bargaining to outright begging as the legal implications of Sarah's discoveries became clear. When his attorney informed him about the financial evidence we'd compiled, Brandon apparently realized that his situation was far more serious than a simple adultery case. Claire, please call me back, his most recent message said. I know I made mistakes, but involving forensic accountants and threatening criminal charges is going too far. We can work this out privately if you'll just stop this legal assault. I never meant to hurt you this badly. I didn't respond. Brandon's definition of working things out would involve me accepting a minimal settlement while he escaped consequences for systematic theft and fraud. His Christmas deception had been the catalyst for discovering crimes that went far beyond marital infidelity. The social consequences of my revelations continued rippling through Denver's interconnected professional and social communities throughout January and February. Brandon's employer launched an internal investigation after receiving an anonymous tip about expense account irregularities. While I hadn't been the source of that information, I suspected that other people who'd been deceived or insulted by Brandon were finding their own ways to ensure accountability. Patricia called me twice more during this period, each conversation revealing her growing understanding of the disaster her son had created for himself and their family. The second call came after the Denver Business Journal published a brief item about the pharmaceutical company's internal audit and Brandon's suspension pending investigation. Claire, I need you to understand that Richard and I had no idea about the financial issues, she said, her voice carrying none of its former authority. We knew about Vanessa, yes, but we thought it was just an affair that would burn itself out. We never imagined Brandon was stealing from you or committing fraud. Her admission that they'd known about the affair while maintaining friendly relationships with me was almost more insulting than if they'd been completely ignorant. The Thompson family had actively participated in my humiliation while knowing their son was betraying our marriage. Patricia, I appreciate your honesty, but your knowledge of the affair while continuing to invite me to family gatherings shows a level of disrespect that can't be undone with apologies. You're right, of course, we should have handled things differently. But surely you can see that destroying Brandon's career and reputation serves no purpose now. You've made your point. I found her logic fascinating. The Thompson family had enabled Brandon's deception for months, participating in elaborate lies and social manipulations, but they considered my factual disclosure of his crimes to be excessive retaliation. Their concern was entirely focused on limiting consequences rather than acknowledging the scope of harm their complicity had enabled. Brandon destroyed his own career and reputation through choices he made independently over many months. I simply ensured that the truth became known to people who deserved to understand what kind of person they were dealing with. The conversation ended with Patricia's promise to make things right somehow, though she couldn't specify what that would involve or why I should trust any promises from the Thompson family given their history of deception. Meanwhile, my own life was flourishing in ways I hadn't expected. Meridian Marketing had attracted several new clients who specifically sought out my services after hearing about my strategic handling of the divorce situation. The business community's response had been overwhelmingly positive, with many people expressing admiration for my professionalism under extreme personal stress. One particularly gratifying new client was the CEO of a technology startup who'd been dealing with a public relations crisis involving his co-founder's embezzlement. During our initial consultation, he'd been direct about why he'd chosen my company. "I heard about how you handled your personal situation with that pharmaceutical sales guy," he said. "Anyone who can manage their own crisis that strategically while protecting their interests and maintaining their dignity is exactly the kind of person I want managing our corporate reputation." These professional opportunities felt like validation that my approach had been correct. Rather than allowing Brandon's betrayal to define me as a victim, I'd used my expertise to protect myself and demonstrate my capabilities to a broader audience. The Christmas deception that was supposed to destroy me quietly had instead showcased my strategic thinking to potential clients who valued competence under pressure. Nicole and I celebrated this professional growth during a dinner at one of Denver's best restaurants in late February. She'd been my constant support throughout the divorce proceedings, and her friendship had become even more valuable as I rebuilt my social life around authentic relationships rather than social obligations. "You know what's amazing," she said over wine and perfectly prepared salmon. 6 months ago you were planning your life around Brandon's preferences and his family's expectations. Now you're building exactly the kind of business and lifestyle you always wanted but never prioritized. She was right. The marriage had required constant compromise and accommodation that had gradually eroded my sense of personal priorities. Living alone in my downtown loft, managing my business according to my own vision, and choosing relationships based on genuine connection rather than social utility felt like reclaiming parts of myself I'd forgotten existed. The divorce mediation sessions continued throughout February and March, with Brandon's position becoming increasingly desperate as the evidence of his financial crimes accumulated. His attorney had initially tried to portray me as vindictive and emotionally unstable, but Sarah's forensic accounting had made that strategy impossible to maintain. During one particularly tense session, Brandon finally abandoned his denials and attempted what his lawyer probably thought was a strategic confession designed to minimize damages. "Look, I made mistakes," he said, addressing the mediator rather than looking at me directly. "The affair was wrong, and I shouldn't have used joint funds for personal expenses." But Claire's response has been completely disproportionate to what actually happened. She's trying to destroy my entire life over what amounts to relationship problems. I listened to his self-serving summary of months of systematic deception and theft, marveling at his ability to minimize actions that had required elaborate planning and consistent lies. Brandon genuinely seemed to believe that his crimes were simply relationship problems that deserved private resolution rather than public accountability. Daniel responded with the precision I'd come to expect from him. "Mr. Thompson, your client systematically stole over $60,000 from marital assets while conducting an extramarital affair that he funded with stolen money. This isn't a relationship problem, it's financial fraud with aggravating circumstances." The mediator reviewed Sarah's evidence for nearly an hour before delivering her preliminary assessment. Brandon would be required to return all stolen funds plus damages, surrender his claims to several jointly owned assets, and potentially face criminal charges depending on his employer's investigation results. Brandon's face went ashen as he realized that his Christmas engagement to Vanessa had cost him everything he'd been trying to protect. The romantic narrative he'd constructed around their reunion was actually the foundation for financial ruin that would follow him for years. His attorney requested a private consultation, and they returned 20 minutes later with what amounted to complete capitulation. Brandon would accept whatever settlement terms I found acceptable in exchange for my agreement not to pursue criminal charges for the financial fraud. I felt no satisfaction in his defeat, only relief that the legal process was finally reaching conclusion. Brandon's attempts to manipulate and control the situation had failed because he'd fundamentally misunderstood both the evidence against him and my willingness to accept continued deception for the sake of social convenience. The final divorce decree was signed in early April, almost 4 months after Brandon's Christmas proposal to Vanessa had triggered my investigation into his double life. I walked out of the courthouse feeling liberated in ways that went far beyond legal resolution. Brandon had lost his job following his employer's investigation, faced significant financial penalties that would impact him for years, and discovered that his relationship with Vanessa couldn't survive the public exposure of how it had begun. His attempts to build a new life on the foundation of lies and theft had collapsed under the weight of consequences he'd never anticipated. I drove directly from the courthouse to my office where several important clients were waiting to discuss campaigns that would showcase my strategic capabilities to even broader audiences. The divorce had become an unexpected demonstration of my professional skills, attracting opportunities that might have taken years to develop through traditional marketing efforts. That evening, I stood on the balcony of my loft apartment, looking out over downtown Denver's skyline and reflecting on the year's unexpected journey. Brandon's Christmas deception had been designed to eliminate me quietly from his life while positioning him for a fresh start with Vanessa and access to continued financial resources. Instead, his elaborate lies had freed me from a marriage built on false premises while demonstrating my capacity for strategic thinking under extreme pressure. The man who'd tried to manipulate me using information asymmetry and social positioning had discovered that deceiving someone whose professional success depended on reading people accurately was a catastrophic miscalculation. My phone buzzed with a text from Nicole asking about dinner plans, followed by messages from clients discussing upcoming projects, and an invitation to speak at a conference about crisis management in personal and professional contexts. Each notification represented connections based on mutual respect and shared interests rather than social obligation and family pressure. 6 months after finding that champagne receipt in Brandon's coat pocket, I understood that his Christmas betrayal had been the best thing that ever happened to me. Not because I enjoyed his suffering, but because his deception had forced me to reclaim my own agency and build a life that reflected my values rather than other people's expectations. The forensic accountant Sarah had become a friend who occasionally consulted me on cases involving corporate reputation management. My attorney Daniel had referred several clients whose legal problems required strategic communication support. Even the private investigator Marcus had developed into a professional contact who helped my business clients with due diligence and background research. Brandon's elaborate network of lies had introduced me to people whose honesty and competence had become the foundation for genuine professional relationships. His attempts to isolate and deceive me had actually expanded my circle of authentic connections in ways that strengthened both my business and personal life. I poured a glass of excellent wine and raised it toward the mountains visible beyond Denver's downtown lights, toasting the missing chair that had never existed, the Christmas trip that was actually an engagement vacation, and the husband whose deception had inadvertently set me free to discover who I could become when I stopped trying to fit into other people's definitions of who I should be. The revenge had been perfect not because it had punished Brandon proportionally to his crimes, though it had certainly accomplished that, but because it had revealed my own capacity for strategic thinking and dignified response to betrayal. He'd gambled that I would accept continued deception to avoid social embarrassment and financial uncertainty. Instead, his Christmas lies had taught me that some gifts come wrapped in devastating truths that ultimately prove more valuable than any comfortable deception could ever be. Brandon had given me the opportunity to rebuild my life according to my own standards rather than external expectations, and I would be grateful for that unexpected liberation for the rest of my life. The phone call came on a rainy Thursday morning in late April, 3 weeks after the divorce had been finalized. I was reviewing campaign proposals for a new client when my assistant knocked on my office door with an expression that suggested the interruption was significant. "Claire, there's a woman named Vanessa Brooks on line 2. She says it's urgent and personal." I stared at the blinking light on my phone for a full 30 seconds before deciding to take the call. Vanessa's voice was barely above a whisper, strained with what sounded like genuine distress. Claire, I know I'm probably the last person you want to hear from, but I need to talk to you. It's about Brandon, and it's important. I can't imagine what you and I would have to discuss, Vanessa. My business with Brandon is concluded. Please, just 5 minutes. I'm not calling to apologize or make excuses. Something has happened that you need to know about, something that affects you even though you're divorced. Her desperation was palpable through the phone line, and my curiosity overcame my instinct to end the conversation immediately. You have 5 minutes. Brandon has been telling people that you fabricated evidence during the divorce proceedings. He's claiming that you hired someone to create fake financial records and that his job termination was based on false accusations you orchestrated. He's trying to rebuild his reputation by destroying yours. I felt a familiar calm settle over me, the same strategic focus that had guided my response to his Christmas deception. What exactly is he saying, and to whom? He's been networking with pharmaceutical companies in other states, claiming he was the victim of a vindictive ex-wife who used her marketing connections to frame him for crimes he didn't commit. He told the hiring manager at a company in Phoenix that you were mentally unstable and had orchestrated an elaborate revenge scheme because you couldn't handle his success. The audacity was breathtaking but entirely consistent with Brandon's character. Unable to accept responsibility for his actions, he was attempting to rewrite history by positioning himself as the victim of my supposed manipulation. His strategy relied on the assumption that potential employers would accept his version of events without conducting independent verification. Do you have proof of what he's saying? I recorded our last conversation because I was afraid he might try to implicate me in his financial problems. He told me exactly what he was planning to tell employers, and he asked me to corroborate his story if anyone contacted me for references. Vanessa's willingness to betray Brandon's confidence suggested that their relationship had deteriorated significantly since my Christmas revelations had destroyed their engagement. The romantic reunion that had seemed so perfect in December was apparently unable to survive the reality of Brandon's criminal behavior and social ostracism. Why are you telling me this, Vanessa? A long pause before she answered. Because I've spent the last 4 months learning who Brandon really is, and I realized that everything he told me about you was probably a lie too. He painted you as controlling and jealous, but his behavior toward me after the engagement ended showed me what he's actually capable of. Her admission that Brandon had been systematically lying about me during their affair was unsurprising but still infuriating. He'd been constructing false narratives about our marriage to justify his deception to Vanessa, just as he was now creating false narratives about the divorce to justify his behavior to potential employers. What kind of behavior? Threats mostly. He said that if I didn't support his version of events about the divorce, he would make sure everyone knew that I'd knowingly participated in an affair with a married man. He threatened to release private photos and messages if I didn't help him rebuild his reputation. Brandon's pattern of manipulation and control was becoming clearer with each revelation. He'd used deception and financial fraud to manage his double life, and now he was using blackmail and intimidation to manage the consequences of his exposure. The charming man I'd married was revealing himself to be someone capable of systematic emotional and financial abuse. Vanessa, are you willing to provide testimony about what Brandon has told you regarding his employment situation and his plans to discredit me? Yes, if it will help protect you from his lies. I know I participated in hurting you, and I can't undo that. But I can at least make sure he doesn't get away with blaming you for consequences he created himself. After we hung up, I immediately called Daniel to discuss the implications of Brandon's defamation campaign. His advice was characteristically direct and strategic. If Brandon is making false statements about you to potential employers, he's committing defamation that could damage your business reputation. We should send cease and desist letters to any companies where we can document his lies, and consider a defamation lawsuit if the behavior continues. The legal strategy would be straightforward, but I was more interested in the broader pattern of behavior that Vanessa's call had revealed. Brandon wasn't just lying about our marriage, he was attempting to reconstruct his entire professional identity around a narrative that portrayed him as the victim of circumstances beyond his control. I spent that afternoon reviewing everything Sarah had discovered about Brandon's financial crimes, cross-referencing the evidence with his current claims of innocence. His assertion that I'd fabricated financial records was particularly absurd given that most of the documentation had come from banks, credit card companies, and his own employer's internal audit. The beauty of having maintained meticulous records was that Brandon's lies could be easily disproven with independent verification. Any potential employer who conducted basic due diligence would discover that his termination had resulted from corporate expense fraud that was documented through multiple sources, having nothing to do with me or my marketing connections. That evening, Nicole and I met for dinner at a small bistro in Cherry Creek, and I updated her on Vanessa's unexpected call and Brandon's ongoing attempts to rewrite history. Her reaction was immediate and characteristically fierce. "This is what abusers do when they lose control," she said, gesturing with her wine glass for emphasis. "They create alternative narratives that make them the victim while painting their actual victims as the aggressors. Brandon can't accept that his actions had natural consequences, so he's creating a fantasy where you're the villain." Her analysis was correct and professionally relevant. I'd worked with corporate clients facing similar situations where former employees attempted to blame their terminations on discrimination or retaliation rather than accepting responsibility for documented misconduct. The strategies for responding were well established and highly effective. The question is whether to address his lies proactively or wait until they cause actual damage to your reputation, Nicole continued. "Given your visibility in the business community, it might be worth getting ahead of this before it spreads." I'd been thinking along similar lines. My client base included several companies with connections throughout the Southwest business community, and Brandon's lies could potentially reach decision-makers who might influence future opportunities. A proactive response would demonstrate my professionalism while preventing his false narrative from gaining traction. Over the weekend, I crafted a strategy that would address Brandon's defamation while strengthening my own professional reputation. Rather than simply responding defensively to his lies, I would use the situation to showcase my crisis management expertise to a broader audience. I started by contacting 3 business journalists who'd written positively about my company's growth over the past year. I offered them an exclusive interview about crisis management strategies for business leaders, using my personal experience as a case study in maintaining professional effectiveness during personal challenges. The first interview, with Denver Business Today, ran the following Wednesday under the headline, "Local Marketing Executive Turns Personal Crisis into Professional Growth Opportunity." The article included a sidebar summarizing the key lessons from my approach: document everything, maintain professional standards, focus on factual communication, and use expertise strategically to protect interests. The journalist asked directly about rumors of post-divorce retaliation between me and Brandon, giving me the perfect opportunity to address his lies within a broader professional context. There's always potential for misinformation when someone faces consequences for documented misconduct, I explained. My approach has been to maintain complete transparency with legal authorities and business partners, while focusing on building my company's reputation through excellent client service rather than managing other people's attempts to avoid accountability. The article's publication triggered immediate responses from my professional network. Several current clients forwarded the piece to colleagues with comments about my strategic thinking and grace under pressure. 2 potential clients called to schedule consultations after reading about my crisis management approach. Most satisfyingly, I received a call from the CEO of a pharmaceutical company in Phoenix, the same company where Brandon had apparently been spreading lies about my supposed vindictive behavior. The executive had read the article and wanted to verify some claims that had been made by a recent job applicant. "We had someone interview last week who claimed his former wife had orchestrated false fraud charges against him," the CEO said. "After reading your article and doing some basic fact-checking, we're fairly certain he was lying to us about the circumstances of his termination." I confirmed that Brandon Thompson was my former husband and that his termination had resulted from documented corporate fraud that was discovered through his employer's internal audit rather than any external influence. The CEO thanked me for my honesty and mentioned that Brandon's application would not be moving forward. The Phoenix call was followed by similar inquiries from companies in Dallas and Salt Lake City, suggesting that Brandon's job search had been more extensive than Vanessa had indicated. Each conversation followed the same pattern: an HR professional or executive asking for clarification about claims that sounded suspicious, followed by my factual summary of the legal proceedings and documented evidence. Brandon's strategy of claiming victimhood was backfiring spectacularly because he'd chosen to lie about circumstances that could be easily verified through independent sources. His assumption that potential employers would accept his narrative without investigation showed the same arrogant miscalculation that had characterized his approach to our marriage. By early May, I'd received inquiries from 7 companies where Brandon had apparently spread his false narrative about vindictive ex-wife retaliation. Each conversation reinforced my reputation for professionalism and honesty while simultaneously destroying Brandon's credibility with potential employers. The most interesting call came from a consulting firm in Seattle that specialized in pharmaceutical sales training. They'd been considering Brandon for a senior position but had grown suspicious when his references didn't align with his explanations for his employment gap. Thompson claimed that his former wife had connections throughout the pharmaceutical industry and had orchestrated a campaign to damage his reputation, the hiring manager explained. When we started making calls to verify his claims, we discovered that nobody had heard of any such campaign, but everyone had heard about his termination for expense fraud. These conversations revealed the fundamental flaw in Brandon's approach. He was trying to manage his reputation through deception rather than accepting responsibility and demonstrating genuine change. His lies were creating a paper trail of dishonesty that would follow him far longer than the original scandal might have. Meanwhile, my business continued expanding in ways that demonstrated the professional benefits of handling crisis situations with integrity and strategic thinking. The Denver Business Today article had generated interest from companies facing their own reputation challenges, leading to consulting opportunities that showcased my expertise to new industries and markets. One particularly significant new client was a technology startup whose founder had been accused of workplace harassment. Rather than denying the allegations or attacking the accusers, we developed a strategy focused on accepting responsibility, implementing systemic changes, and demonstrating genuine commitment to creating a better workplace culture. I chose your company because of how you handled your personal situation, the founder explained during our initial meeting. You didn't try to destroy your ex-husband or play victim, you documented everything, protected yourself legally, and moved forward with dignity. That's exactly the kind of strategic thinking I need right now. These professional opportunities felt like validation that my approach to Brandon's betrayal had been correct not just morally, but strategically. Rather than allowing his deception to define me as a victim or responding with emotional retaliation, I'd used my expertise to protect my interests while maintaining my professional reputation. The contrast with Brandon's current situation was stark and telling. His attempts to avoid consequences through continued deception were destroying his professional prospects, while my transparent approach to crisis management was generating new business opportunities and strengthening my reputation. In late May, Vanessa called again with an update that confirmed the futility of Brandon's job search strategy. He'd apparently given up on finding employment in pharmaceutical sales and was considering relocating to a different state where his reputation hadn't been damaged. He's talking about starting over completely, she said. New career, new location, maybe even changing his name legally. He seems to think that running away will solve his problems. The conversation reinforced my understanding of Brandon's fundamental character flaws. Rather than accepting responsibility for his actions and working to rebuild trust through consistent honest behavior, he was choosing to construct new deceptions in different locations. His pattern of manipulation and avoidance would likely continue until he faced consequences severe enough to force genuine self-reflection. Has he stopped making false claims about me to potential employers? I asked. I think so, mainly because it backfired so completely. Everyone he talked to either already knew the truth or could easily verify what actually happened. His lies were making things worse instead of better. After that conversation, I realized that Brandon's defamation campaign had been self-defeating in ways he probably still didn't understand. His attempts to blame me for his professional problems had actually strengthened my reputation while destroying his own credibility with multiple potential employers. The situation reminded me of lessons I'd learned early in my marketing career about the importance of message consistency and factual accuracy. Lies require constant maintenance and eventual collapse under scrutiny, while truth becomes stronger when examined closely. Brandon's elaborate Christmas deception had failed for the same reasons his current lies were failing. They required more energy to maintain than they were worth, and eventually contradicted observable reality. By June, 6 months after the divorce was finalized, I'd received inquiries from 12 companies where Brandon had apparently spread false information about me. Each conversation had ended with the potential employer thanking me for my honesty and indicating that Brandon's application would not be considered further. His lies had not only failed to rehabilitate his reputation but had actively damaged his employment prospects in ways that would persist long after the original scandal had faded from public memory. Future employers would remember him as someone who'd lied during interviews, rather than someone who'd made mistakes and learned from them. The final vindication came in early July when I received a call from the ethics compliance officer at Brandon's former employer. They were conducting a follow-up investigation into his expense fraud and wanted to verify that I'd received no complaints about harassment or retaliation from Brandon or his representatives. "We want to ensure that Mr. Thompson hasn't attempted to intimidate or threaten you in connection with his termination," the compliance officer explained. "We take these situations very seriously and want to make sure all parties feel safe from potential retaliation." I confirmed that while Brandon had made false statements about me to potential employers, he hadn't engaged in direct harassment or threats. The compliance officer thanked me for my cooperation and mentioned that their investigation had been complicated by Brandon's continued lies about the circumstances of his termination. "It's unusual for someone to keep claiming innocence when the evidence is so clear," she said. "Most people in his situation accept responsibility and focus on moving forward constructively." That conversation crystallized my understanding of why Brandon's Christmas deception had been so devastating to his long-term prospects. His inability to accept responsibility for his choices meant that he continued making decisions based on the same flawed thinking that had gotten him into trouble originally. I spent that evening on my apartment balcony, looking out over Denver's skyline and reflecting on the year's journey from devastating betrayal to professional triumph. Brandon's elaborate Christmas lies had been designed to eliminate me from his life while preserving his reputation and financial resources for a fresh start with Vanessa. Instead, his deception had freed me from a marriage built on false premises while providing opportunities to demonstrate my strategic capabilities under extreme pressure. His continued lies about the divorce had further damaged his reputation while strengthening mine through contrast with his dishonesty. The most satisfying aspect of the entire situation was its completeness. Brandon hadn't just lost our marriage and his relationship with Vanessa, he'd destroyed his professional reputation, damaged his family's social status, and created a pattern of documented dishonesty that would follow him wherever he tried to rebuild his life. Meanwhile, I'd built a thriving business, strengthened authentic relationships, and developed a reputation for integrity and strategic thinking that was attracting opportunities I'd never imagined possible. The Christmas betrayal that was supposed to destroy me had instead revealed capabilities I hadn't known I possessed and values I was proud to defend publicly. As I raised a glass of excellent wine toward the mountains, I realized that Brandon had given me the most valuable gift imaginable, the opportunity to discover who I could become when I stopped trying to accommodate other people's deceptions and started building my life according to my own standards of honesty and excellence. His perfect Christmas surprise had indeed changed everything, just not in the way he'd intended. 1 year after that December morning when I found the champagne receipt, I was standing in the ballroom of the Broadmoor Hotel in Colorado Springs, overseeing the setup for what would become the most talked-about corporate event of the season. The irony wasn't lost on me that this was the same venue where Brandon and I had exchanged vows 3 years earlier, back when I believed I understood the man I was marrying. The client was a Fortune 500 technology company celebrating their acquisition of 3 smaller firms, and they'd specifically requested my services after hearing about my crisis management expertise. The CEO had been direct during our initial consultation about why he'd chosen Meridian Marketing over larger, more established firms. "We need someone who understands how quickly things can go wrong and how to manage complex situations involving multiple stakeholders with competing interests," he'd said. "Your reputation for staying calm under pressure and thinking strategically about long-term consequences is exactly what we need for this integration celebration." As I watched my team coordinate with caterers, florists, and technical staff, I reflected on how dramatically my professional life had evolved since Brandon's Christmas deception had forced me to rebuild everything I'd taken for granted. Meridian Marketing now employed 12 people and managed campaigns for clients across the western United States, with a waiting list that extended 6 months into the future. The growth hadn't happened by accident. Every client who'd hired me after learning about my personal situation had been impressed not just by my strategic thinking, but by my ability to maintain professional standards while navigating personal chaos. The divorce had become an inadvertent demonstration of my core competencies, attracting exactly the kind of sophisticated clients who valued discretion, integrity, and results under pressure. My phone buzzed with a text from Nicole, who was coordinating media coverage for tonight's event. Channel 7 wants an interview about your business growth over the past year. Should I set it up for after the event? I smiled as I typed back my agreement. A year ago, I'd been planning my life around Brandon's preferences and his family's social expectations, carefully managing my ambitions to avoid overshadowing his fragile ego. Now I was being recognized as one of Denver's most successful young entrepreneurs, with media outlets seeking my insights on business strategy and crisis management. The transformation hadn't been easy, but it had been comprehensive. I'd learned to trust my instincts about people and situations rather than accommodating behavior that felt wrong for the sake of maintaining relationships built on false premises. The marriage had taught me the difference between genuine partnership and elaborate performance, a distinction that now guided both my personal and professional decisions. Patricia Thompson's voice interrupted my thoughts as she approached from across the ballroom. I hadn't seen her since our last uncomfortable phone conversation 6 months earlier, and her presence at tonight's event was unexpected and unwelcome. "Claire, you look wonderful," she said, extending her hand with the kind of careful courtesy that suggested she was here for a specific purpose. "I hope you don't mind my attending. Richard and I know several people from the technology company, and they invited us to celebrate their expansion." I accepted her handshake with professional composure, though I was calculating the implications of her presence. The Thompson family had been relatively quiet since Brandon's departure from Denver, focusing on managing their own reputation damage rather than continuing their campaign of social manipulation. "Of course, Patricia, I hope you enjoy the evening. Actually, I was hoping we might have a private word before the festivities begin. There's something I think you should know about Brandon's current situation." My instinct was to decline, but curiosity overcame caution. Patricia had information she considered significant enough to risk an uncomfortable conversation in a public setting, which suggested that Brandon's attempts to rebuild his life elsewhere had encountered new complications. We moved to a quiet alcove overlooking the hotel's gardens, where Patricia's carefully maintained composure cracked slightly as she delivered news that explained her unexpected appearance. "Brandon was arrested last month in Phoenix on charges of identity theft and wire fraud," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Apparently, he'd been using false credentials and fabricated references to obtain employment with a medical device company. They discovered the deception when they tried to verify his pharmaceutical sales background. The information hit me with a mixture of vindication and genuine sadness. Brandon's pattern of deception had escalated from marital infidelity and expense fraud to criminal behavior that would likely result in federal charges. His inability to accept responsibility for his original crimes had led him deeper into a spiral of lies that was now threatening his freedom." "How long has this been going on?" I asked. "We think about 6 months. After he couldn't find legitimate employment because of his reputation, he apparently started creating false identities and fake work histories. The Phoenix company had paid him nearly $40,000 in salary and commissions before they discovered that none of his credentials were real." Patricia's revelation explained why Brandon's defamation campaign against me had eventually stopped. He'd been too busy constructing elaborate lies for potential employers to focus on blaming me for his problems. His criminal behavior had escalated beyond anything I could have imagined when I first discovered his Christmas affair. "Why are you telling me this, Patricia?" "Because Richard and I realize that we owe you an enormous apology. We enabled Brandon's deception during your marriage, and we initially blamed you for the consequences of his behavior. We've spent the past year watching him make increasingly destructive choices, and we finally understand that you were protecting yourself from someone who was genuinely dangerous." Her admission was both gratifying and heartbreaking. The Thompson family's social standing had been built on carefully managed appearances, and Brandon's criminal behavior was destroying their reputation in ways that went far beyond divorce scandal. They were finally confronting the reality that their son was capable of systematic fraud and manipulation. "I never wanted Brandon to face criminal charges," I said honestly. "I just wanted him to stop lying and accept responsibility for his choices. We know that now. Your response to his betrayal was measured and appropriate. If you'd tried to cover up his financial fraud or accepted his false explanations, he might have continued escalating until someone got seriously hurt." Patricia's analysis was probably correct. Brandon's pattern of manipulation and control required increasingly elaborate deceptions to maintain, and my exposure of his Christmas lies had prevented him from perfecting techniques he was now using for criminal purposes. The divorce had been a warning he'd ignored, leading to consequences that were far more serious than anything I'd ever intended. What happens now? His attorney thinks he'll serve at least 18 months in federal prison, possibly longer depending on what else they discover during the investigation. There may be other victims in different states who haven't come forward yet. We stood in uncomfortable silence for several minutes, processing the implications of Brandon's complete self-destruction. The charming man I'd married had revealed himself to be someone capable of sustained criminal behavior, validating every instinct I'd had about the need to protect myself completely during our divorce. Claire, I need you to know that Richard and I deeply regret how we handled your marriage to Brandon. We should have supported you instead of enabling his deception. You deserved better from all of us. Patricia's apology felt genuine, though it came far too late to repair the damage their complicity had caused. The Thompson family's social maneuvering and deliberate blindness to Brandon's character flaws had contributed to an environment where his worst impulses could flourish unchecked. I appreciate you telling me about the arrest, I said. I hope Brandon gets the help he needs to understand why his behavior has been so destructive. After Patricia left, I returned to supervising the event setup with a strange sense of closure. Brandon's Christmas deception had been the catalyst for discovering not just his affair and financial fraud, but a pattern of manipulation that had apparently been escalating for years. My strategic response to his betrayal had protected me from someone who was genuinely dangerous rather than merely selfish and unfaithful. The evening's celebration proceeded flawlessly, with 300 guests enjoying an event that showcased Meridian Marketing's capabilities to potential clients throughout the region. I moved through the crowd with confidence, discussing business opportunities and building relationships that would sustain my company's growth for years to come. During the dinner portion of the evening, I was approached by James Morrison, the CEO of a pharmaceutical consulting firm based in Seattle. His company specialized in helping medical device manufacturers navigate regulatory compliance issues, and he'd been following my career since the Denver Business Today article about crisis management. Ms. Thompson, I wonder if you might be interested in consulting on a project that requires exactly your kind of strategic thinking, he said. We're working with a company that's dealing with some executive misconduct issues, and they need someone who understands how to manage complex reputation challenges while maintaining business operations. The conversation led to a consulting contract that would expand Meridian Marketing services into new industries while providing opportunities to work with clients facing sophisticated compliance and reputation challenges. James's company had specifically sought out my expertise because of my demonstrated ability to navigate personal crisis while maintaining professional effectiveness. As the evening wound down, I found myself standing on the hotel's terrace, looking out over the same mountain views that had provided the backdrop for my wedding to Brandon. The location that had once represented the beginning of what I'd believed was my perfect life had become the setting for celebrating the business I'd built from the ashes of his deception. Nicole joined me on the terrace, carrying 2 glasses of champagne and wearing the satisfied expression of someone who'd executed a complex project flawlessly. So, she said, raising her glass in a toast, from finding a champagne receipt in a cheating husband's pocket to running Colorado's most successful crisis management firm. Not the year you expected, I'm guessing. I laughed and clinked my glass against hers. Definitely not what I expected, but exactly what I needed. Brandon's lies forced me to discover capabilities I didn't know I had, and values I'm proud to defend publicly. Any regrets about how you handled the whole situation? I considered her question seriously, reviewing the choices I'd made from that first morning, when I'd found the Aspen Ritz Carlton receipt through tonight's celebration of everything I'd built afterward. No regrets about exposing his deception or protecting myself legally. If I'd handled things differently, I might have enabled him to continue escalating his criminal behavior. The divorce wasn't just about ending our marriage, it was about preventing him from perfecting techniques that he's apparently been using to defraud other people. Nicole nodded thoughtfully. It's remarkable how someone can seem so normal and charming while being capable of systematic fraud and manipulation. You must have incredible instincts to have recognized that something was fundamentally wrong with his character. Her observation made me reflect on the subtle signs I'd noticed but initially dismissed during our marriage. Brandon's casual relationship with truth, his tendency to blame external circumstances for personal failures, and his comfort with manipulating people's emotions to achieve his goals had all been present from the beginning. I'd attributed these traits to confidence and ambition, rather than recognizing them as indicators of deeper character flaws. I think I knew something was wrong, but didn't trust my instincts because I wanted the marriage to work, I said. The Christmas deception was so blatant and elaborate that I couldn't rationalize it away anymore. Well, his loss turned out to be your gain professionally and personally, from what I can see. She was right. The year since Brandon's betrayal had brought professional opportunities and personal growth that might have taken decades to achieve under different circumstances. My business had expanded beyond my most optimistic projections. My reputation for integrity and strategic thinking was attracting increasingly sophisticated clients, and I'd developed confidence in my ability to handle whatever challenges might arise. More importantly, I'd learned to trust my judgment about people and situations rather than accommodating behavior that felt wrong for the sake of maintaining relationships. The marriage had taught me the difference between genuine partnership and elaborate performance, making me better equipped to build authentic connections in both personal and professional contexts. As we walked back toward the ballroom, my phone buzzed with a text from Daniel, my attorney, congratulating me on the evening's success and mentioning that he'd received inquiries from 3 potential clients who'd attended tonight's event. The business growth that had begun with my strategic response to Brandon's deception was continuing to accelerate through referrals and reputation. The drive back to my downtown loft took me past several landmarks that had been significant during my marriage to Brandon. Our former apartment building, the restaurant where he'd proposed, the Thompson family estate in Cherry Hills Village where I'd spent countless hours trying to fit into their vision of appropriate behavior. Each location now felt like a museum exhibit from someone else's life, representing a period when I'd been willing to compromise my instincts and accommodate other people's expectations, rather than building a life that reflected my own values and capabilities. The woman who'd lived in that beautiful Beacon Hill brownstone and planned her schedule around her husband's preferences felt like a character from a novel rather than my actual past. My current apartment was smaller but infinitely more satisfying because every decision had been made according to my preferences alone. The industrial aesthetic, downtown location, and carefully chosen artwork reflected my personality rather than compromise between competing visions of appropriate style. I spent that night reviewing the contracts and proposals that had resulted from the evening's networking, planning expansions that would position Meridian Marketing for continued growth, while maintaining the quality standards that had become our signature. The business had become more successful than I'd ever imagined possible when I'd started the company, and tonight's event had generated opportunities that would sustain growth for the next several years. But the most satisfying aspect of my current situation wasn't professional success or financial independence, though both were gratifying. It was the knowledge that I'd responded to devastating betrayal with strategic thinking and dignity rather than emotional retaliation or vindictive behavior. Brandon's Christmas deception had been designed to eliminate me from his life while preserving his reputation and resources for a fresh start with Vanessa. Instead, his elaborate lies had provided me with the motivation and opportunity to build a more successful and authentic life, while his continued dishonesty had destroyed his prospects for legitimate employment and apparently led to criminal behavior. The revenge had been perfect not because it had punished Brandon proportionally to his crimes, though it had certainly accomplished that, but because it had revealed my own capacity for strategic thinking and principled response to manipulation. He'd gambled that I would accept continued deception rather than face the uncertainty of rebuilding my life according to my own standards. 6 months later, I received a letter forwarded through my attorney from Brandon, who was apparently serving his federal prison sentence while awaiting trial on additional charges in 2 other states. The letter was a masterpiece of self-serving justification disguised as apology, acknowledging his mistakes while continuing to minimize the scope of his deception and its impact on others. I realize now that my actions hurt you deeply, and I'm sorry for the pain I caused, he wrote. I hope you can find it in your heart to forgive me for the mistakes I made during our marriage. I never intended for things to escalate the way they did. The letter's tone suggested that Brandon still fundamentally misunderstood the nature of his behavior and its consequences. His crimes weren't mistakes or escalation, but deliberate choices that revealed character flaws he apparently still refused to acknowledge fully. I didn't respond to the letter. Brandon's current situation was the natural result of choices he'd made independently over many months, and my forgiveness wouldn't change the legal consequences he was facing or the pattern of behavior that had led to his imprisonment. 2 years after finding the champagne receipt that started everything, I was featured on the cover of Colorado Business Magazine as one of the state's entrepreneurs to watch. The article detailed Meridian Marketing's growth from a small crisis management firm to a regional leader in strategic communications, with particular emphasis on my company's reputation for integrity and effectiveness under pressure. The journalist asked directly about the role my personal experiences had played in my professional development, giving me an opportunity to reflect publicly on lessons that had shaped both my business philosophy and my approach to relationships. Discovering that someone you trust has been systematically deceiving you teaches valuable lessons about the importance of documentation, strategic thinking, and maintaining your principles even when it would be easier to compromise. Those same skills that help you navigate personal crises turn out to be exactly what clients need when they're facing reputation challenges or complex stakeholder management issues. The article generated speaking opportunities at conferences throughout the Western United States, where I presented case studies in crisis management and reputation recovery to audiences of business leaders, attorneys, and other professionals who dealt regularly with complex ethical challenges. During one particularly memorable presentation in Las Vegas, an audience member asked whether I ever regretted exposing my ex-husband's deception so publicly rather than handling the situation more privately. The question assumes that private resolution was actually an option, I replied. When someone is systematically deceiving you while using shared resources to fund behavior designed to end your relationship, private confrontation rarely produces honest answers or meaningful change. Sometimes public accountability is the only way to protect yourself and prevent the behavior from continuing with other victims. The answer generated sustained applause from an audience that included several attorneys and business executives who dealt with similar situations involving employee misconduct or partnership disputes. My experience had become a case study in effective crisis management that applied to situations far beyond marital infidelity. 3 years after that December morning when everything changed, I was invited to speak at a women's leadership conference in San Francisco about strategic thinking and personal empowerment. The audience included entrepreneurs, executives, and professionals from various industries who were interested in developing skills for navigating complex challenges while maintaining their integrity. During the question and answer session, a young attorney asked how I'd maintained my composure and strategic focus while dealing with such a personal betrayal. The key was recognizing that emotional reactions rarely produce optimal outcomes, I explained. When you discover that someone has been systematically deceiving you, your first instinct might be to confront them immediately or seek some kind of immediate emotional satisfaction. But taking time to gather information, understand the full scope of the situation, and plan a strategic response usually produces better long-term results. But how did you resist the urge for immediate confrontation? Didn't you want to make him suffer the way he'd made you suffer? The question touched on something I'd thought about extensively during the years since my divorce. I realized that the most effective response to deception isn't emotional retaliation, it's strategic exposure of the truth in ways that protect your interests while ensuring natural consequences for the person who chose to lie. Brandon's Christmas deception created its own punishment when the truth became known to people who mattered. After the conference, I flew back to Denver feeling grateful for the opportunities that had emerged from what had initially seemed like devastating personal destruction. Brandon's elaborate lies had forced me to discover capabilities I hadn't known I possessed and values I was proud to defend publicly. The business continued growing, my reputation for integrity and strategic thinking continued attracting sophisticated clients, and I developed confidence in my ability to handle whatever challenges might arise. More importantly, I'd learned to trust my judgment about people and situations rather than accommodating behavior that compromised my principles. On the 4th anniversary of finding that champagne receipt, I was driving through Aspen on my way to a client meeting when I passed the Ritz Carlton where Brandon had proposed to Vanessa during his supposed Chicago business trip. The sight of the hotel triggered a flood of memories about that December morning when everything had started unraveling, but instead of pain or anger, I felt profound gratitude. Brandon's Christmas deception had been intended to destroy me quietly while preserving his options for a fresh start. Instead, his elaborate lies had become the catalyst for building a more successful and authentic life than I'd ever imagined possible. The champagne receipt that had revealed his betrayal had also revealed my own capacity for strategic thinking and principled response to manipulation. I pulled over at a scenic overlook and called Nicole to share the moment and reflect on how dramatically our lives had changed since that terrible and wonderful December morning. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't found that receipt?" she asked. I think I would have discovered his deception eventually, I replied. But finding it when I did gave me time to respond strategically rather than reactively. If I'd confronted him without evidence or caught him in the act rather than having time to plan, the outcome might have been very different. Well, however it happened, I'm grateful it led you to discover who you really are when you're not trying to accommodate someone else's lies. After we hung up, I sat in my car looking out over the Colorado mountains, reflecting on the journey from devastating betrayal to professional triumph and personal empowerment. Brandon's Christmas surprise had indeed changed everything, just not in the way he'd intended. The man who'd tried to eliminate me from his life through elaborate deception had inadvertently freed me to discover my own strength and build a future based on authentic values rather than social convenience. His perfect revenge had become my perfect liberation, and I would be grateful for that unexpected gift for the rest of my life. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.